When my son told me his wife still needed $300,000 and was already on her way to my apartment, I stood in my kitchen with my late husband's bank papers in my hand. But when my daughter-in-law walked through my door dressed like she owned my life, I finally understood the truth my heart had been refusing to say she had on a $4,000 dress. I know that because I looked it up the next day, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold beside me, typing the label I'd spotted on the tag when she turned to drape her coat over the arm of my sofa. The coat she laid on my sofa like it was a hotel luggage rack. The sofa my husband Arthur picked out at a clearance sale in 2003 because we were saving for Caleb's college fund, and we couldn't justify spending more than $400 on something we'd just be sitting on. That sofa is 22 years old. Veronica's dress cost 10 times what we paid for it. She clicked into my apartment like she was arriving somewhere she'd already decided to redecorate. Heels on my laminate floor. That particular sound, sharp, decisive, each step a small announcement, followed her everywhere she went. I had noticed it the first time Caleb brought her to dinner. How she moved through space like she was charging admission. Behind her, my son looked like a man walking to his own sentencing. He's 53 years old, my Caleb. He has his father's jaw and his father's shoulders and none of his father's spine. And standing in my doorway that evening with his eyes already sliding away from mine, he looked so much like the boy who used to hide failed tests under the bathroom rug that something in my chest folded in on itself. I had already been standing in the kitchen for 30 minutes before they knocked, holding a manila envelope I had not yet put down. I hadn't offered them tea. I hadn't smiled. I just stepped back from the door and watched them come inside. And then I'd stood in the middle of my living room, this humble, honest apartment that Veronica had always surveyed with barely concealed contempt, and I'd waited. I was 68 years old. I had buried my husband. I had raised a son largely alone through accounting busy seasons and 60-hour work weeks, packing his lunches and attending his school plays, and sitting with him through nights when the world felt too heavy. I had done all of this and come out the other side with nothing left to prove to anyone, but I had not been prepared for this. I want to be honest about that, because this story doesn't make me look heroic every step of the way. I made mistakes. I believed things I shouldn't have believed. I let love do what love sometimes does to intelligent women. Blind them, soften them, convince them that trust is the same thing as safety. It isn't. I know that now. Arthur knew it too, I think. He just never found the words to tell me. My husband died on a Tuesday morning in March 4 years ago. He was 61 years old and he was at his desk reviewing a client's quarterly filing and his heart simply stopped. Catastrophic failure, the cardiologist told me. No warning signs they would have caught in a routine checkup. He was just gone. Arthur Reyes had worked at the same accounting firm for 31 years. He had started as an associate and risen to senior partner not by charming anyone or playing politics, but by being the most relentlessly reliable man in any room he entered. He was not flashy. He drove a used Honda Accord. He bought his suits at the end of season sales, and he wore the same watch for 20 years because it still worked, and he saw no reason to replace something that still worked. We took one vacation in those 31 years, 2 weeks in Costa Rica for our anniversary, 2011. We almost didn't go because a client had a complicated restructuring, and Arthur felt guilty stepping away. I had to remind him that the firm would not come to his funeral. He came. When he died, he left me $800,000. Every cent of it earned in increments so small over years so long that I could feel the weight of every one of them when I held the estate paperwork. He had wanted me to be okay. That was the entire architecture of his financial life. The skipped vacations, the clearance rack purchases, the 12-hour days. He wanted to make sure that when he was gone, I would be okay. I had been okay. For almost 2 years after his death, I had been okay. And then Caleb came to me with the story about the joint account. It was a Sunday afternoon in early June, about 8 months before the night I'm describing. He came alone, which should have told me something because Veronica was usually velcroed to his side at family visits, draped over the couch with her phone, performing the bored patience of someone enduring something beneath them. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and he had that look. I know that look in my marrow. He had it at 14 when he broke the neighbor's fence with a baseball and needed me to come with him to apologize. He had it at 22 when he'd gambled away part of his first paycheck and needed to borrow money until the next one. The look of a boy who needs something from you and hates himself for needing it and is hoping that your love will do the work of dissolving your judgment. He said the account was just a formality, a safety net, in case something happened to him, a medical emergency, a car accident, some situation where he couldn't reach me in time and bills needed to be paid or decisions needed to be made. It would stay untouched. He'd never even log in. It was just practical, responsible even. He used the word responsible. I remember that specifically. I was still so deep in grief then. 14 months out from losing Arthur and still sleeping on my side of the bed because the other side felt like a country that had been closed. Caleb sitting across from me, looking so much like his father with his dark eyes and his nervous hands, talking about responsibility and safety and practicality. I thought, this is Arthur's son doing what Arthur would have done, planning ahead, taking care of the people he loves. I transferred $300,000 into a joint account. I want to sit with that sentence for a moment because I've had to sit with it for 8 months and it has not gotten lighter. $300,000. The money Arthur stood at a copy machine for, the money he ate desk lunches for, the money he chose over every vacation and every new suit and every small luxury he deserved and never took. I handed it over in a bank transfer and I I smiled at my son, and I felt, for the first time in 14 months, like something had connected, like I was still part of a family. The first withdrawal appeared on a Thursday. $1,200. Car repair. Caleb texted me about it that same afternoon. The explanation delivered before I'd even noticed the charge. Preemptive, smooth. I thought nothing of it. The second was 2 weeks later. $4,000. A medical test that insurance wouldn't fully cover. Something with his back. Nothing serious, but the specialist was out of network. He texted me about that one too. Then the texts started spacing out. The explanations got shorter. The amounts got larger. I want to be fair to myself. I did not notice immediately. This is not a story where I was sharp and vigilant, and the truth just kept eluding me. I was a 67-year-old woman still learning how to exist in the world, without the person who had been at the center of it for 34 years. I was not studying my bank statements with the attention they deserved. I was surviving. But then Ruth called. Ruth Okafor has been my best friend for 26 years. We met at a neighborhood association meeting in 1998 and discovered that we both thought the meeting was a waste of time, and we've been friends ever since. She is 71 years old. She has the energy of a woman half that age, and she has never in her life kept a diplomatic thought in her head when a direct one would serve better. She called me on a Wednesday evening in late January and she said, "Eleanor, I saw your daughter-in-law at the Northgate Mall today." I said, "Oh?" because I wasn't sure what I was supposed to say. "She had 6 shopping bags," Ruth said. "Not 6 small bags. 6 large bags." I counted. She was with 2 other women, and they were laughing like they'd just won something. She paused. I recognized the bags. One of them was from the store where a single scarf costs $800. I thanked her and said I'd look into it. That night, I looked into it. I sat down at my kitchen table with a cup of tea, and I pulled up 3 months of account statements on my laptop, and I went through every line. I had to do it twice, because the first time through, I kept stopping and putting my hand over my mouth. Beauty salon charges, hair, nails, facials, something called a hydrodermabrasion series. Over the prior 3 months, $12,340. Designer boutiques, names I recognized from magazine covers I'd never bought. $23,000 and some change. A restaurant I'd never heard of. A single dinner. $8,200. Shoes, perfumes, spa memberships, day treatments at a place in the financial district that required a minimum booking of $1,500. Not a single car repair, not a single medical test. Not a burst pipe or a dental emergency or any of the careful, reasonable explanations that had been texted to me with such practiced warmth. I sat at that table for a long time after I finished. Then I got up and I washed my cup and I went to bed, because I knew that what came next was going to require me to be rested. I confronted Caleb the following Saturday. I asked him to come for lunch, and I made the meal he'd always loved. Rice, beans, the oxtail stew I'd learned from Arthur's mother, the recipes Veronica had always declined politely, citing dietary things I suspected were really just aesthetic things. I set the table properly, the way I always had for family. I used the good place mats. He walked in and seemed surprised to find the food waiting. I think he'd prepared himself for an ambush, not a meal. I let him sit. I let him serve himself. I let him eat almost all of it, because I knew what came next, and I wanted him to have the dignity of a full stomach when it arrived. Then I laid the bank statements in front of him. I had organized them carefully. 3 months of charges, highlighted in yellow where I thought the amounts were most significant, arranged chronologically so he couldn't claim confusion about the timeline. I had written the total at the bottom of the last page in red ink, $68,240. That was just the 3 months I'd reviewed closely. The number was higher if you went back further. He looked at them for a long time without touching them. 30 seconds, maybe 45. I watched his face. There was a moment, brief, maybe 2 seconds, where something shifted behind his eyes. Something that looked to me like recognition. Not surprise, recognition. Then he pushed the folder back toward me. He said I was being selfish. He said it quietly, almost gently, the way you'd say something you'd rehearsed many times and finally decided you believed. He said Veronica had had a difficult upbringing, that she'd grown up watching other women have things she never had, that she deserved to feel good about herself, to feel like she hadn't spent her whole life outside the window looking in. He said it was easy for me to judge because I'd never had to go without. I sat very still. I thought about the clearance rack suits, the Honda Accord, the one vacation. He said I had more money than I needed and was clinging to it out of fear. He said I was clinging to it like a corpse. That was the exact phrase. I remember it because it was the first moment in that conversation when I understood that I was not talking to my son, not fully. I was talking to something that had been constructed in his place over time, something that wore his face and used his voice, and had his particular way of rubbing his thumb along his jawline when he was uncomfortable, but said things my son would never have said about his father's legacy. My son, who used to save his allowance in a jar labeled college because Arthur had talked to him about compound interest at age 9. My son, who cried at his father's grave, clinging to it like a corpse. Arthur was dead 2 years. His money was still keeping me warm, and my son was sitting across from me in the kitchen, where his father had eaten breakfast for 30 years, telling me I was wrong to hold on to it. I kept my face very still. I have a talent for stillness that I developed over 30 years of marriage to a man who needed calm around him when he was stressed, who could not think clearly if the air around him was charged. I had learned to be his calm. I use that skill now like a wall between my face and what I was feeling. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I folded the statements back into their folder, slowly, crease by crease. "Thank you for coming," I said. "I'll think about what you've said." He hugged me at the door, briefly, like a man checking a box. I stood at my kitchen window and watched his car pull out of the lot. I stood there until it was gone. Then I went to the sink and washed the dishes we'd used. Both plates, both glasses, the serving spoon for the stew. That night, at 8:03 p.m., my phone lit up with a text alert from the bank. Account transfer initiated. Amount, $172,800. I stood in my kitchen in my slippers, and I read that number on my screen. I read it once. I read it again. I turned off the kitchen light and stood in the dark for a moment, and something in me went very, very quiet. Not grief, not anger. Something older than either of those things. The stillness that comes when you finally know exactly what you're dealing with. I was at the bank when it opened the following Monday morning. I sat with a branch manager named Sergio Marchetti, 30-something, careful, clearly uncomfortable with what he was hearing, and I told him everything. I closed the joint account. I restructured all of my accounts. I set up two-factor authentication on every platform. I made it a condition of any transaction that required either a phone call from me personally or my physical presence with identification. Sergio said gently that I should consider speaking to an attorney. I told him I was already planning to. My attorney's name is Dwight Osei. He has been my family's attorney for 14 years, specializing in estate and financial law, and he has the particular quality of a man who has seen every variation of human greed and still manages to be surprised by none of them. When I walked into his office the following week with my folder of statements and my notes on the timeline, he put on his reading glasses and worked through every page without a word. When he finished, he set the folder down. "Eleanor," he said, "you know what this is." I said I did. He said we had several avenues depending on what I wanted. If I wanted to recover the money, we had documentation of unauthorized spending patterns and potential grounds for a civil suit given the nature of how the access was granted. If I wanted to protect myself going forward, we had clear steps. If I wanted to pursue criminal fraud, he paused there. He said that was a more complicated road. I said I wasn't sure yet what road I wanted. He said to take my time, but he said it quickly, and then he said something else. "Before you decide anything, I want you to talk to someone at the Elder Protective Services unit at the county DA's office. Not because you have to do anything, just because I want you to have the full picture." He made a call from his desk while I sat there. And that is how I first spoke to Investigator Pamela Quintero. Investigator Quintero came to my apartment the following Thursday afternoon. She was 44 years old, 12 years in elder financial abuse investigations, and she had a manner of sitting very still and listening that reminded me, unexpectedly, of Arthur. She wore a lanyard with the county seal. She brought nothing to write on. She just listened. I told her everything from the beginning. The joint account, the withdrawals, the confrontation, the $172,800 transfer, the texts about emergencies that never existed. I laid out the bank statements. She looked at them without touching them, the way a person looks at something they already understand. When I finished, she said, "Mrs. Reyes, you're not the first family member I've sat across from in this situation, and I want to be honest with you about what we're looking at." She explained that what I was describing, the gradual access, the rehearsed justifications, the escalation, the preemptive narratives, fit a pattern her unit had documented in hundreds of cases. She said the transfer of $172,800 on the night of a direct confrontation was particularly significant from an evidentiary standpoint. She said she wanted to open a file. I said she could. She asked if I had any other family, anyone connected to either Caleb or Veronica who might provide context or corroboration. I told her Caleb's father was dead. I told her that Veronica had, as far as I knew, a mother living in the same city, but that we had never met. Caleb had mentioned briefly and only once that the relationship was strained. Investigator Quintero wrote something on a card. She said she'd be in touch. She was. Sooner than I expected. 12 days later, she called me. "Mrs. Reyes," she said, "I've been doing some background work on your daughter-in-law. There are some things I think you should know." She came back to my apartment. This time she brought a thin folder, which she set on my kitchen table and opened, but did not immediately share. She told me that Veronica, whose full name was Veronica Hartley, born Veronica Kane, had a prior civil judgment filed against her in another county from 5 years ago. A family member, an elderly aunt, had sued her for unauthorized use of funds from a jointly held account. The case had settled out of court. The terms were sealed. She told me that Veronica had listed a different last name on her driver's license at the time of the prior case than the name she was using now. She told me that Veronica's mother, a woman named Catherine Hartley, 63 years old, living 40 minutes from my apartment, had been contacted as part of the background inquiry. I felt something cold move through me when she said that. She looked at me carefully and said, "Mrs. Reyes, Catherine Hartley wants to talk to you." Catherine came to my apartment on a Wednesday afternoon. She brought nothing, no proof, no folder, no prepared speech. She was a small woman, thin in the way of someone who'd worried themselves thin over many years, and she sat on Arthur's clearance sale sofa with her hands folded in her lap, and she looked at me with an expression I can only describe as long, exhausted relief. She told me about her daughter's childhood, which was ordinary. She told me about the years when Veronica had been charming and warm and the kind of daughter people envied. She told me about the first time something small disappeared from her wallet, then a larger amount from her checking, then the request, gentle, reasonable, just for a little while, just as a formality, to be added to a joint account. Catherine had said no. She had said no because she'd already seen the pattern once before with her own sister, and she had recognized it. What happened resigned after she said no. What Veronica had done to her reputation within the family, to her relationships, to her standing. Catherine described without bitterness, but precisely, the way someone describes something they've had a long time to understand. She finds people who are grieving, Catherine told me. She's very patient. She waits until the vulnerability is real, and then she moves slowly enough that by the time you see it, you've already given too much. I asked her why she was telling me this. She looked at her hands. Because she's pregnant, she said, and I don't want to watch her do to that child what she does to everyone else. We sat quietly for a moment. Would you be willing to speak to an investigator? I asked. She said yes. She said she'd been waiting for someone to ask. I called Dwight Ozzie that evening. He called Investigator Quintero. By the end of the week, Catherine had given a full recorded statement, and Investigator Quintero had begun coordinating with the Civil Fraud Unit at the DA's office. I had my own work to do. I spent 3 evenings at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, building a timeline. Every date, every amount, every text message, every phone call I could remember, notated with as much precision as I could reconstruct. I had screenshots of every exchange. I had learned in the year after Arthur died to document things carefully, because grief makes your memory unreliable, and I had needed to be able to prove to myself what had and hadn't happened. Those habits served me now. I had the bank statements printed and sorted. I had the account opening documents signed by both Caleb and me, with the stated purpose handwritten in the field that read intended use. I had the closing documents showing the timing of the $170,800 transfer relative to my confrontation with Caleb. The gap between my confrontation and the transfer was approximately 11 hours. Dwight reviewed the timeline when I brought it to his office. He read through every page without speaking, the way he always does. He is a methodical man, and he does not offer assessments before he's finished. When he set the last page down, he said one phrase: a demonstrably reactive act following disclosure. He was describing a legal concept, the idea that the timing of the transfer told a story independent of any other evidence. He said it twice. Attorneys repeat things when they want you to understand that the repetition is intentional. Then he told me something that surprised me. He said Caleb's exposure in this situation was not trivial. He said that as the named joint account holder, the person who had specifically represented the purpose of the account to me and then facilitated its use for a different purpose entirely, Caleb was not a bystander. He was a participant. Whether he had acted willingly or under some form of prolonged coercion or influence was a question that might ultimately carry weight with a judge. It might humanize him. It might matter at sentencing, if it came to that. But it would not, Dwight said carefully, protect him from the civil claims. I sat with that for a long time. Long enough that Dwight's assistant brought in a second cup of coffee I hadn't asked for, which told me she'd been listening through the door. My son, my Arthur's boy, the one who had cried at his father's grave and needed me to put my arm around him because he couldn't hold himself up. I asked Dwight what I should do about the pregnancy text, the high-risk condition, the $50,000 for treatments, the language about my grandchild. He said to preserve them all, screenshotted with date and time metadata intact, filed in sequence, not responded to. He said that the framing of those texts, the specific invocation of the unborn child as leverage, would be relevant to the case's emotional and legal context. He said the word leverage, and then seemed to reconsider it and said framing instead. But the first word was the right one, and we both knew it. I didn't respond to the texts. Not one. I also made an appointment with my physician, Dr. Sandra Okonkwo, who has been my doctor for 11 years. She is 52, board certified in internal medicine, and she has never in my experience softened a truth because she thought I might prefer a comfortable version of it. I drove to her office, sat down, and told her everything. I wanted it on record, I said, formally in my chart in her clinical notes, that I was cognitively clear, that I had not been confused or pressured or acting from any form of diminished capacity, that every decision I had made and was continuing to make was informed, deliberate, and autonomous. I wanted documentation that could not be challenged. Not now. Not in any future proceeding where someone might argue that a 68-year-old widow with a lot of money had simply been confused about what she'd agreed to. Dr. Okonkwo listened to all of it. She asked a few precise questions about sleep, about appetite, about whether I was experiencing any difficulty with concentration or memory. Then she set her pen down. Eleanor, she said, you're one of the sharpest patients I have. If anyone tries to claim diminished capacity, I will be the first person in that courtroom. She dictated a clinical note while I was still in the office. I heard her use the phrase, demonstrates clear and consistent executive function. I thanked her and drove home. I cooked dinner. I watched television. I went to bed at 10, and I slept well, which surprised me until I realized it shouldn't have. I had been carrying uncertainty for months. Uncertainty is the heaviest thing. Now the weight had a shape, and shaped things can be handled. Caleb texted me 4 days before they came. It was brief. The message said that he and Veronica had found a house, that the deposit was $300,000, that other buyers were already interested and they needed to move within the week, that he knew things had been complicated between us, but that he needed me to understand this was important. He said, Mom, please. I read it twice. I put the phone down on the counter. I stood at my kitchen window looking out at the parking lot, the way I often stand when I need to think, because Arthur used to joke that my best thinking happened standing up. I called Dwight. I called Investigator Quintero. Then I called Ruth and asked her if she'd be available to sit with me the following evening. She said, of course. She didn't ask ask why. And then I texted Caleb back, come Thursday evening, both of you. I am a woman who has buried her husband. I have held vigil in a hospital corridor. I have signed papers and closed accounts and sorted through 31 years of a man's belongings and decided what to keep and what to let go. I was not afraid of Thursday, but I want to tell you what Thursday felt like, because I think it matters. It felt like standing at the edge of something that had been approaching for a long time. Not a disaster, not a storm. Something more like a reckoning. Slow building, weather-fronted, the kind of change that is already inevitable by the time you feel it in your joints. I dressed carefully. I wore the gray cardigan Arthur always said made me look like I meant business. I set the living room in order. I placed the manila envelope on the kitchen counter where I could reach it. At 6:45, I heard heels on the walkway. I did not move toward the door. Caleb knocked. I opened it, and there she was. The dress was structured, deep burgundy, the kind of thing designed to make a room feel like it belongs to you. Her hair was perfect. Her makeup was precise and expensive looking. She walked in ahead of my son. I noticed that, Caleb trailing behind her, and she looked around my apartment with the expression she always wore here, neutral on the surface, faintly evaluating underneath. Caleb would not look at me. Eleanor. Veronica set her bag on my sofa, my Arthur's sofa, and turned to face me with the particular warmth of someone performing warmth. It's been too long. We should have come sooner. We've been meaning to. I said nothing. Caleb tells me you have some hesitations. She sat, crossed her ankles, arranged herself. I think once we talk through everything, you'll see that this really is a sound investment. Real estate in this area. Veronica, I said, let Caleb speak first. She paused. A small adjustment behind the eyes. Caleb stepped forward finally. He spoke quietly, ashamed. He has always had the grace to be ashamed, which is the part of this that still breaks something in me. He talked about the house, about the neighborhood, about the school district, though the pregnancy was barely showing, and we were many years from school districts, which told me the talking points were Veronica's and he was delivering them. He talked about opportunity and family and how much this would mean. Then Veronica finished what he'd started. You have $500,000, Eleanor. Her voice was pleasant, level, the voice of a woman who has had this conversation before and won it before. It's sitting there. You're 68 years old. I say that with love, not to be unkind. But what exactly are you saving it for? Caleb stared at the floor. She added, the grave? The room went so quiet I could hear the refrigerator hum. I stood up. I walked to the kitchen. I picked up the manila envelope. I came back and stood in the center of my living room, and I looked at my daughter-in-law in her $4,000 dress, and my son who could not look up from the floor, and I said, before either of you say another word, I need to tell you about a visitor I had this week. Veronica's face did not change yet. Not yet. She had good control. Your mother came to see me. The change happened in stages, like watching something drain. The color, first, a slow withdrawal, starting at the jaw, then the set of the mouth, then the hands. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag with a precision that suggested effort. Caleb turned to look at her slowly. The way you turn when you've heard a sound you can't identify. Your mother? You said your mother wasn't in contact, Veronica said, very quietly. She's been in contact with me, I said, for about 12 days. I opened the envelope. I laid the bank statements on the coffee table one by one, the way you'd set out photographs, deliberately, giving each one space. She told me about your aunt in Fairfield County, I said. The joint account, the civil judgment that was filed and then settled. She told me about the name you were using then, which wasn't the name you're using now. I looked at Veronica. She told me everything, actually. She's been waiting to tell someone for years. She just needed someone to ask. Caleb had gone the color of old paper. He was looking at his wife now, not at the floor. And there was something happening in his face that I hadn't seen before. Something being rewritten in real time. There's also an investigator, I said. Her name is Pamela Quintero. 12 years in elder financial abuse with the county DA's office. She's been building a file. I let that sit. Dwight Osei has reviewed the timeline. He's already been in touch with the civil division. Veronica opened her mouth. The $172,800, I said. Transferred 8 minutes after you left my kitchen, Caleb. That's in the file too. Caleb closed his mouth. I looked at my son, this man who had his father's jaw and had stood in my doorway looking pale and trapped, who had called me selfish with words his wife put in his mouth, who I had loved for 53 years, and who had let himself become something his father would not have recognized. I looked at him for a long moment. I loved your father every day I was married to him, I said, and he worked every day of his adult life so that I would be okay. I intend to be okay. Not for spite, not for victory, because that is what he wanted, and I am still the person he trusted with it. I picked up the envelope. I looked at Veronica. Catherine said to tell you she loves you, I said. She also said she'd be in court if it came to that. The heels did not click when she left. That was 4 months ago. Caleb called me 3 weeks after that evening. Not Veronica. Caleb. He called at 9 in the morning on a Saturday, and he sat on the phone with me for 2 hours, and he did not ask me for anything. He talked. He told me things I had suspected, and things that surprised me, and a few things that I set quietly aside for another day. He cried twice, which he has not done with me since he was a teenager. I did not tell him it was okay, because not all of it was okay, but I listened. He is seeing a therapist now. His name is Dr. Randall Breyer, 14 years in practice, and Caleb says he is patient and direct and challenging in the right ways. The DA's Civil Fraud Division has an open file. Dwight says the timing of the $172,800 transfer is the strongest piece of evidence, what he calls a demonstrably reactive act following disclosure of wrongdoing. He says there are other other cases investigator Quintero's unit has been building that may intersect with ours. He says to be patient. I am a patient woman. The pregnancy is real. I think about that. I think about what kind of grandmother I will be when that child arrives, and whether I will be permitted to be one, and what it means to love someone who does not exist yet through the wreckage that surrounds their beginning. I don't have answers to those questions. I suspect some of them don't have answers yet. What I have is this apartment, Arthur's sofa, the recipes his mother taught me and that I'm slowly writing down because someone should have them, a best friend named Ruth who counts shopping bags and calls me in the evening, an attorney who knows my full name, an investigator with 12 years of experience who still sounds surprised when I ask how her week has been, and the bank accounts, protected, documented, every dollar watched. My husband spent 31 years making sure I would be okay. I am keeping that promise for him. That's all I needed to say.